So late medieval armour breaks down into Italian or German, right? No, that's an urban myth. It's far more complicated. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Scholar Gladiator. Now you will notice I am a lover of armour, and I've been a lifelong, almost since a very young age, student of armour. And I always felt when looking at knightly effigies and brasses and art and stuff like this that there seemed to be a distinctive style of English armour. And this of course is something that people like Toby Capwell have researched and written lots of books about. But when you think about it, if we have an English style of armour, and we know that there's High Gothic, for example, Gothic German style of armour from the let's say mid 1470s or 1480s onwards. There's definitely Italian styles of armour which were exported all over Europe and influenced other places. Obviously, we're going to get other regional styles, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. So, there's this cool new book by Chris Dobson, Master Armourer, and I'll stick a link down below to it, and it's called Art and Armour of the Western Alps, or in the Western Alps, sorry. And this is quite fundamentally making the argument, or giving some evidence for the fact that there is a distinctive regional style around Savoy and Piedmont in this region where essentially Italy, or what's now Italy, butts up against France. And of course, when you think about it, this makes sense. This is a region of the Alps which is extremely kind of fluid in terms of its cultural influences, but also military and political, intermarriages between different noble houses and trade. This was a very interesting area. Now, of course, this isn't the only area of Europe where this happened. We see similar things in the Iberian Peninsula, for example, and the connection between England and Portugal. We also see it in the Eastern Alps as well, where there's the sort of relationship between Austrian and the Holy Roman Empire and northern Italy and around Venice, and then down into Dalmatia and so on and so forth. I've talked about styles of swords, for example, which came into that region from Dalmatia, and the use of the Schiavoni mercenaries. So we often think about armour or arms in a very compartmentalised thing, and when I was growing up, every book you bought on armour talked about German armour and Italian armour, and then not an awful lot else. And these days, we fully accept that there are Franco-Burgundian English styles of armour, there's Iberian styles of armour. Even if you go into Sweden, where there's probably more German influence of armour, you find regional styles. This is true all over Europe, okay? And this is due to many, many different reasons. It can be due to the ruling class who were in that area at the time. We find this, of course, with swords later on in the 17th century. We see Spanish influence in the Netherlands because of the Spanish influence there. Anyway, right, on to this book. So fundamentally, this is one of Chris Dobson's usual beautifully illustrated, and I have to say very well produced books. We have previously looked at Beaten Black and Blue, and the kind of, I suppose, I don't know if revolutionary is perhaps too strong a word, but the sort of strong statement behind this is that a lot of medieval armour was not necessarily highly polished, knight in shining white armour that you always think of. Now, I've made the counter argument that I think an awful lot of it actually was, and I think a lot of people agree with me on that, but actually that's not so important as what's contained in this book, which is now out of print, unfortunately, which is fundamentally that a lot of armours were treated in other ways. They were blacked or blued or russeted. There was peacock blue, which is an argument that Chris Dobson makes. Obviously painted armours as well, certain kind of grey finishes, and then obviously also silvering and gilding and things like that. So that book, really, really good book. Whether you agree with all of the assertions made in it or not, there's a lot of very interesting material in there, and it is worth thinking about. And also, Chris Dobson, who is he? So he is for many decades now, several decades. I first met Chris back in the early 2000s, maybe end of the 90s, around the year 2000. And I've done one of his armour. I was one of the lecturers at one of his arms and armour conferences in Florence, and another one in Vienna. And so he has for a long time been a armourer, manufacturer of high quality replica armour, but also a restorer. And that's really the important thing that he brings to these books, is that Chris has had hands-on and in many cases restored many of the armours you see in places like Vienna, for example. And he's had very hands-on, close-up experience with real armours in some of the leading collections of Europe. Right, so onto this book. So the basic assertion of this: art and armour in the Western Alps, Milan, Savoy and the French style, 1400 to 1500. So that's an important thing to mention. So this is late medieval, early Renaissance. So we're talking about the year 1400 to 1500, so 15th century essentially. And primarily plate armour, but mail is also discussed in here as well. And really it's looking at this particular area of the Western Alps and looking at what are the characteristics that we see in armour in this region, and really making overall, if I was to summarise, it's making the argument that there is a distinctive style of armour in this region. So one of the key pieces of evidence that Chris uses is art, particularly frescoes. So here we've got some nice examples, and one of the great things about this book is they are all illustrated beautifully with artwork that Chris himself has been exposed to, and indeed copyrighted works from people like the Royal Armouries, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and so on and so forth. And it goes into the development as well of close helmets. One thing that I noticed really interesting in here was to do with sallets. And one of the interesting details, there's an example just there, is that in the art available in this region, hearing holes or holes around the ears seem to be something which are really popular. Now, it's not to say you don't find them in other areas. In fact, you find them in German sallets as well sometimes. And this region seems to have, it's predominantly Italian, but it has some French influence and perhaps even to some extent at various points a little bit of German influence and from other areas. But what's interesting is there are tendencies. So this is essentially looking at one region for one period of time and what are the tendencies in this region. And these holes in the sallet seem to have been something that was really popular in this period, in this area. Another nice example just there. Just to give another example and staying on sallets for a second, another thing which seems to be particularly popular in this region, and again, it's not saying you don't find these in other regions, but it seems to have been something which seems to have potentially been popular specifically in Piedmont, are sallets which have a portion of the brow which comes down in the middle. So in other words, it arches over the eyes. And of course, most sallets don't. They go either straight across here or around here. So again, very interesting to find these regional tendencies. And this gives us a far richer and deeper understanding of the development and tendencies in armour in different areas and how they interacted. So what I would say is this is an incredibly detailed book, and I haven't got my head around all of the implications and assertions that are made in this yet. So obviously I recommend, if you want to know more about this specific region and period of armour, and for people who are just generally interested in 15th century armour, these sorts of works, I think, are really invaluable, even if you don't necessarily agree with every assertion that the author, Chris Dobson in this case, makes. The fact is we don't have an awful lot of books which deep dive into specific aspects of 15th century armour. And it's incredibly thought-provoking. It makes you question some of your assumptions about how certain armour styles spread and what proportion of them were used in different areas, because not everybody was wearing the same armour all over Europe, of course. And obviously this particular region is heavily Italian influenced. But the basic assumption, or assertion rather, here is also that there was a very strong particular regional preference, but also a strong French influence as well. And the whole book is absolutely beautifully illustrated. So it's got tons and tons of artwork, which is just absolutely fantastic to have at your fingertips without having to trawl the internet for it. So it's a beautifully illustrated book, nice glossy paper. The font size is very good, easy to read. It is detailed, it is really detailed, and I think that most people, we can see we go into mail here as well, and there's some interesting things. You know, there's someone here with a mail shirt but with pointing showing at the arm harness. So there is a lot of detail in here to unpick. And so I would suggest that most people, if you get this book, will probably want to read through it 4 or 5 times, I think, before some of it starts to sink in. Very, very interesting pauldrons here, for example, in a form that I don't think I was particularly familiar with. But funnily enough, these are at the Royal Armouries. We've got other examples here from the Metropolitan Museum of Art of these vambraces. So anyway, I'll stick the link below. Chris Dobson, Art and Armour of the Western Alps. This is a real deep dive, very specific book, but it's got examples of armour in there that you will recognise from major museums as well. Some artwork you will recognise from maybe other books or seeing them online, but there is a lot of original artwork in here as well that Chris has photographed himself and procured and found himself, and so there's some stuff in here you almost certainly will not have seen before. So there we go, link below. If you can get hold of a copy, it's out of print now, but of Beaten Black and Blue, I recommend that. That is a very thought-provoking book as well. And myself, I recently acquired a new armour which is brightly polished, but my next armour, I'm thinking about a different finish for it, so that book is giving me a lot of thoughts and inspiration for that. But there we go, Art and Armour of the Western Alps, and there are more books coming out and available from Chris right now, but also coming out soon as well, and I'm sure we'll look at those in due course. So there we go. If you want another great book about 15th century armour to get your teeth into and open up your mind about the region of Piedmont and Savoy and all around there, and even Milan. And interestingly, there are Fiore connections in here. So if you've looked at some of the armets and even pauldrons in Fiore and wondered about those, there's literally direct stuff in here. So it seems, and I've always asserted that Fiore has a strong connection to Milan. Well, we know that because he refers to the Duke of Milan. So anyway, I won't spoiler you, but there's stuff about that in here, including images from Fiore's treatises. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I hope this has been useful. Hopefully, if you're interested in the book, you will enjoy that, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.